The Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones are an English rock band formed in London in 1962. The first stable lineup consisted of bandleader Brian Jones, guitar, harmonica, keyboards, Mick Jagger, lead vocals, harmonica, Keith Richards, guitar, vocals, Bill Wyman bass, Charlie Watts, drums, and Ian Stewart, piano. Stewart was removed from the official lineup in 1963 but continued to work with the band as a contracted musician until his death in 1985. The band's primary songwriters, Jagger and Richards, assumed leadership after Andrew Loog Oldham became the group's manager. Jones left the band less than a month before his death in 1969, having already been replaced by Mick Taylor, who remained until 1974. After Taylor left the band, Ronnie Wood took his place in 1975 and continues on guitar in tandem with Richards. Since Wyman's departure in 1993, Darryl Jones has served as touring bassist. The Stones have not had an official keyboardist since 1963, but have employed several musicians in that role, including Jack Nitzsche, 1965 to 1971, Nicky Hopkins, 1967 to 1982, Billy Preston, 1971 to 1981, Ian Gillan, 1978 to 1981, and Chuck Leavell, 1982 present. The Rolling Stones were at the forefront of the British invasion of bands that became popular in the United States in 1964 and were identified with the youthful and rebellious counterculture of the 1960s. Rooted in blues and early rock and roll, the band started out playing covers but found more success with their own material. Songs such as I Can't Get No, Satisfaction and Painted Black became international hits. After a short period of experimentation with psychedelic rock in the mid-1960s, the group returned to its bluesy roots with Beggar's Banquet, 1968, Let It Bleed, 1969, Sticky Fingers, 1971, and Exile on Main Street, 1972. It was during this period they were first introduced on stage as the greatest rock and roll band in the world. The band continued to release commercially successful albums through the 1970s and early 1980s, including Some Girls, 1978, and Tattoo You, 1981, the two bestsellers in their discography. During the 1980s, the band infighting curtailed their output and they only released two more underperforming albums and did not tour for the rest of the decade. Their fortunes changed at the end of the decade, when they released Steel Wheels, 1989, promoted by a large stadium and arena tour, the Steel Wheels, Urban Jungle Tour. Since the 1990s, new material has been less frequent. Despite this, the Rolling Stones continue to be a huge attraction on the live circuit. By 2007, the band had four of the top 5 highest-grossing concert tours of all time: Voodoo Lounge Tour, 1994 to 1995, Bridges to Babylon Tour, 1997 to 1998, Licks Tour, 2002 to 2003, and A Bigger Bang, 2005 to 2007. Musicologist Robert Palmer attributes the endurance of the Rolling Stones to their being rooted in traditional verities, in rhythm and blues and soul music, while more ephemeral pop fashions have come and gone. The Rolling Stones were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989 and the UK Music Hall of Fame in 2004. Rolling Stone magazine ranked them fourth on the 100 Greatest Artists of All Time list and their estimated record sales are above 250 million. They have released 30 studio albums, 23 live albums and numerous compilations. Let It Bleed, 1969, marked the first of 5 consecutive #1 studio and live albums in the UK. Sticky Fingers, 1971, was the first of 8 consecutive #1 studio albums in the US. In 2008, the band ranked 10th on the Billboard Hot 100 All-Time Top Artists chart. In 2012, the band celebrated its 50th anniversary. They still continue to release albums to brisk sales and critical acclaim. Their most recent album Blue and Lonesome was released in December 2016 and reached #1 on the UK album charts and #4 in the US and won a Grammy Award for Best Traditional Blues Album. The group also continues to sell out venues, with their No Filter tour ongoing since September 2017. History. Early history. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger became childhood friends and classmates in 1950 in Dartford, Kent. The Jagger family moved to Wilmington, Kent, 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers, away, in 1954. In the mid-1950s, Jagger formed a garage band with his friend Dick Taylor. The group mainly played material by Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Howlin' Wolf and Bo Diddley. Jagger met Richards again on October 17, 1961 on Platform 2 of Dartford Railway Station. The Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters records Jagger was carrying revealed a shared interest. A musical partnership began shortly afterwards. Richards and Taylor often met Jagger at his house. The meetings moved to Taylor's house in late 1961 where Alan Etherington and Bob Beckwith joined the trio. The quintet called themselves the Blues Boys. In March 1962, the Blues Boys read about the Ealing Jazz Club in Jazz News newspaper, which mentioned Alexis Korner's rhythm and blues band, Blues Incorporated. The group sent a tape of their best recordings to Korner, who was favorably impressed. On 7th of April, they visited the Ealing Jazz Club where they met the members of Blues Incorporated, who included slide guitarist Brian Jones, keyboardist Ian Stewart and drummer Charlie Watts. After a meeting with Korner, Jagger and Richards started jamming with the group. Jones, no longer in a band, advertised for bandmates in Jazz Weekly, while Stewart found them a practice space. Together they decided to form a band playing Chicago blues. Soon after, Jagger, Taylor and Richards left Blues Incorporated to join Jones and Stewart. The first rehearsal included guitarist Jeff Bradford and vocalist Brian Knight, both of whom decided not to join the band. They objected to playing the Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley songs preferred by Jagger and Richards. In June 1962 the addition of the drummer Tony Chapman completed the lineup of Jagger, Richards, Jones, Stewart, and Taylor. According to Richards, Jones named the band during a phone call to Jazz News. When asked by a journalist for the band's name, Jones saw Muddy Waters LP lying on the floor. One of the tracks was Rolling Stone. 1962 to 1964, building a following. Jones, Jagger, Richards, Stewart, and Taylor played a gig billed as the Rolling Stones on July 12, 1962, at the Marquee Club in London. Shortly afterwards, the band went on their first tour of the UK, which they called a training ground tour, because it was a new experience for all of them. Their material included the Chicago blues as well as Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley songs. The band's original rhythm section did not include bassist Bill Wyman, who joined in December 1962, or drummer Charlie Watts, who joined in January 1963. By 1963 they were finding their musical stride as well as popularity. In 1964 two unscientific opinion polls rated the band as Britain's most popular group, outranking even the Beatles. The band's name was changed shortly after their first gig to the Rolling Stones. The group's then acting manager, Giorgio Gomulski, secured a Sunday afternoon residency at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, London, in February 1963. He claimed this triggered an international renaissance for the blues. In May 1963, the Rolling Stones signed Andrew Loog Oldham as their manager. His previous clients, the Beatles, directed the former publicist to the band. Because Oldham was only 19 and had not reached the age of majority, he was also younger than anyone in the band. He could not obtain an agent's license or sign any contracts without his mother co-signing. By necessity he joined with booking agent Eric Easton to secure record financing and assistance booking venues. Gomulski, who had no written agreement with the band, was not consulted. Initially, Oldham tried applying the strategy used by Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, and have the band members wear suits. He later changed his mind and imagined a band which contrasted with the Beatles, featuring unmatched clothing, long hair, and an unclean appearance. He wanted to make the Stones a raunchy, gamey, unpredictable bunch of undesirables and to establish that the Stones were threatening, uncouth and animalistic. Stewart left the official lineup, but remained road manager and touring keyboardist. Of Stewart's decision, Oldham later said, "Well, he just doesn't look the part, and 6 is too many for fans to remember the faces in the picture. Later, Oldham reduced the band members' ages in publicity material to make them appear as teenagers. Decca Records, which had declined to sign a deal with the Beatles, gave the Rolling Stones a recording contract with favorable terms. The band got 3 times a new act's typical royalty rate, full artistic control of recordings and ownership of the recording master tapes. The deal also let the band use non-Decca recording studios. Regent Sound Studios, a mono facility equipped with egg boxes on the ceiling for sound treatment, became their preferred location. Oldham, who had no recording experience but made himself the band's producer, said Regent had a sound that leaked, instrument to instrument, the right way, creating a wall of noise that worked well for the band. Because of Regent's low booking rates, the band could record for extended periods rather than the usual 3-hour blocks common at other studios. All tracks on the first Rolling Stones album, The Rolling Stones, were recorded there. Oldham contrasted the Rolling Stones' independence with the Beatles' obligation to record in Emmy's studios, saying it made them appear as mere mortals, sweating in the studio for the man. He promoted the Rolling Stones as the nasty counterpoint to the Beatles by having the band pose unsmiling on the cover of their first album. He also encouraged the press to use provocative headlines such as, "Would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone?" By contrast, Wyman says, "Our reputation and image as the bad boys came later, completely there, accidentally. Oldham never did engineer it. He simply exploited it exhaustively." In a 1972 interview, Wyman stated, "We were the first pop group to break away from the whole Cliff Richard thing where the bands did little dance steps, wore identical uniforms and had snappy patter." A cover version of Chuck Berry's Come On was the Rolling Stones' first single, released on June 7, 1963. The band refused to play it at live gigs, and Decca bought only one ad to promote the record. With Oldham's direction, fan club members bought copies at record shops pulled by the charts, helping Come On rise to number 21 on the UK singles chart. Having a charting single gave the band entree to play outside London, starting with a booking at the Outlook Club in Middlesbrough on 13th of July, sharing the billing with the Hollies. Later in 1963, Oldham and Easton arranged the band's first big UK concert tour as a supporting act for American stars including Bo Diddley, Little Richard and the Everly Brothers. The tour gave the band the opportunity to hone their stagecraft. During the tour the band recorded their second single, a Lennon-McCartney penned number entitled I Wanna Be Your Man. The song was written and given to the Stones when John Lennon and Paul McCartney visited them in the studio, as the two Beatles liked giving the copyrights to songs away to their friends. It reached number 12 on the UK charts. The Beatles' 1963 album, With the Beatles, includes their version of the song. On January 1, 1964, the Stones' I Wanna Be Your Man was the first song ever performed on the BBC's Top of the Pops. The third single by the Stones, Buddy Holly's Not Fade Away, reflecting Bo Diddley's style, was released in February 1964 and reached number 3. Oldham saw little future for an act that lost significant songwriting royalties by playing songs of what he described as middle-aged blacks, limiting the appeal to teenage audiences. Jagger and Richards decided to write songs together. Oldham described the first batch as soppy and imitative. Because the band's songwriting developed slowly, songs on their first album The Rolling Stones, 1964, issued in the US as England's newest hitmakers, were primarily covers, with only one Jagger, Richards original, Tell Me, You're Coming Back, and 2 numbers credited to Nankerfelge, the pen name used for songs written by the entire group. The Rolling Stones' first US tour in June 1964 was a disaster according to Wyman. When we arrived, we didn't have a hit record there, or anything going for us. When the band appeared on the variety show The Hollywood Palace, that week's guest host, Dean Martin, mocked both their hair and our performance. During the tour they recorded for 2 days at Chess Studios in Chicago, meeting many of their most important influences, including Muddy Waters. These sessions included what would become the Rolling Stones' first #1 hit in the UK, their cover version of Bobby and Shirley Womack's It's All Over Now. The Stones followed the famous Flames, featuring James Brown, In the theatrical release of the 1964 film T.A.M.I. Show, which showcased American acts with British invasion artists. According to Jagger, "We weren't actually following James Brown because there was considerable time between the filming of each section." Nevertheless, he was still very annoyed about it. On 25th of October the band appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. Because of the pandemonium surrounding the Stones, Sullivan banned them from his show. However, he booked them for an appearance in the following year. Their second LP, 12 by 5, which was only available in the US, was released during the tour. During the early Stones releases, Richards was typically credited as Richard. The Rolling Stones' fifth UK single, a cover of Willie Dixon's Little Red Rooster with Off the Hook, credited to Nankerfelge, as the B-side, was released in November 1964 and became their second #1 hit in the UK. The band's US distributors, London Records, declined to release Little Red Rooster as a single. In December 1964, the distributor released the band's first single with Jagger, Richards' originals on both sides, Heart of Stone, with What a Shame as the B-side. The single went to number 19 in the US. 1965 to 1967, Height of Fame. The band's second UK LP, The Rolling Stones' #2, was released in January 1965 and reached #1 on the charts. The US version, released in February as The Rolling Stones, Now, reached #5. The album was recorded at Chess Studios in Chicago and RCA Studios in Los Angeles. In January and February that year the band played 34 shows for around 100,000 people in Australia and New Zealand. The single The Last Time, released in February, was the first Jagger, Richards composition to reach #1 on the UK charts. It reached #9 in the US. It was later identified by Richards as the bridge into thinking about writing for the Stones. It gave us a level of confidence, a pathway of how to do it. Their first international #1 hit was, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, recorded in May 1965 during the band's third North American tour. Richards recorded the guitar riff that drives the song with a fuzzbox as a scratch track to guide a horn section. Nevertheless, the final cut was without the planned horn overdubs. Issued in the summer of 1965, it was their fourth UK #1 and their first in the US, where it spent 4 weeks at the top of the Billboard Hot 100. It was a worldwide commercial success for the band. The US version of the LP Out of Our Heads, released in July 1965, also went to no one. It included 7 original songs, 3 Jagger, Richards numbers and 4 credited to Nankerfelge. Their second international #1 single Get Off of My Cloud was released in the autumn of 1965, followed by another US-only LP, December's Children. The album Aftermath, released in the late spring of 1966, was the first LP to be composed entirely of Jagger, Richards songs. It reached #1 in the UK and #2 in the US. On this album Jones' contributions expanded beyond guitar and harmonica. To the Middle Eastern influenced Paint It Black he added sitar, to the ballad Lady Jean he added dulcimer, and to Under My Thumb he added marimbas. Aftermath also contained Goin' Home, a nearly 12-minute long song that included elements of jamming and improvisation. The Stones' success on the British and American singles charts peaked during the 1960s. 19th Nervous Breakdown was released in February 1966, and reached #2 in the UK and US charts. Paint It Black reached #1 in the UK and US in May 1966. Mother's Little Helper, released in June 1966, reached #8 in the US. It was one of the first pop songs to discuss the issue of prescription drug abuse. Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, Standing in the Shadow? Was released in September 1966 and reached #5 in the UK and #9 in the US. It had a number of firsts for the group. It was the first Stones recording to feature brass horns, and the back cover photo on the original US picture sleeve depicted the group satirically dressed in drag. The song was accompanied by one of the first official music videos, directed by Peter Whitehead. January 1967 saw the release of Between the Buttons, which reached #3 in the UK and #2 in the US. It was Andrew Oldham's last venture as the Rolling Stones producer. Alan Klein took over his role as the band's manager in 1965. Richards recalled, "There was a new deal with Decca to be made, and he said he could do it." The US version included the double A-side single Let's Spend the Night Together and Ruby Tuesday, which went to number 1 in the US and number 3 in the UK. When the band went to New York to perform the numbers on The Ed Sullivan Show in January, they were ordered to change the lyrics of the refrain of Let's Spend the Night Together to Let's Spend Some Time Together. In early 1967, Jagger, Richards and Jones began to be hounded by authorities over their recreational drug use, after News of the World ran a 3-part feature entitled Pop Stars and Drugs, Facts That Will Shock You. The series described alleged LSD parties hosted by the Moody Blues attended by top stars including The Who's Pete Townshend and Cream's Ginger Baker, and alleged admissions of drug use by leading pop musicians. The first article targeted Donovan, who was raided and charged soon after. The second installment, published on 5 February, targeted the Rolling Stones. A reporter who contributed to the story spent an evening at the exclusive London club Blazes, where a member of the Rolling Stones allegedly took several Benzedrine tablets, displayed a piece of hashish and invited his companions back to his flat for a smoke. The article claimed this was Mick Jagger, but it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. The reporter had in fact been eavesdropping on Brian Jones. 2 days after the article was published, Jagger filed a writ for libel against the News of the World. A week later, on 12 February, Sussex police, tipped off by the paper, which had been tipped off by his chauffeur, raided a party at Keith Richards' home, Redlands. No arrests were made at the time, but Jagger, Richards and their friend art dealer Robert Fraser were subsequently charged with drug offenses. Andrew Oldham was afraid of being arrested and fled to America. Richards said in 2003, "When we got busted at Redlands, it suddenly made us realize that this was a whole different ball game, and that was when the fun stopped. Up until then it had been as though London existed in a beautiful space where you could do anything you wanted." On the treatment of the man responsible for the raid, he later added, "As I heard it, he never walked the same again." In March 1967, while awaiting the consequences of the police raid, Jagger, Richards and Jones took a short trip to Morocco, accompanied by Marianne Faithfull, Jones' girlfriend Anita Pallenberg and other friends. During this trip, the stormy relations between Jones and Pallenberg deteriorated to the point that she left Morocco with Richards. Richards said later, "That was the final nail in the coffin with me and Brian. He'd never forgive me for that, and I don't blame him, but hell, shit happens." Richards and Pallenberg would remain a couple for 12 years. Despite these complications, the Rolling Stones toured Europe in March and April 1967. The tour included the band's first performances in Poland, Greece, and Italy. On May 10, 1967, the day Jagger, Richards and Fraser were arraigned in connection with the Redlands charges, Jones' house was raided by police. He was arrested and charged with possession of cannabis. 3 of the 5 Stones now faced drug charges. Jagger and Richards were tried at the end of June. Jagger received a 3-month prison sentence for the possession of 4 amphetamine tablets. Richards was found guilty of allowing cannabis to be smoked on his property and sentenced to a year in prison. Both Jagger and Richards were imprisoned at that point but were released on bail the next day pending appeal. The Times ran the famous editorial entitled "Who Breaks a Butterfly Upon a Wheel?", in which conservative editor William Rees-Mogg surprised his readers by his unusually critical discourse on the sentencing, pointing out that Jagger had been treated far more harshly for a minor first offense than any purely anonymous young man. While awaiting the appeal hearings, the band recorded a new single, "We Love You," as a thank you for their fans' loyalty. It began with the sound of prison doors closing, and the accompanying music video included allusions to the trial of Oscar Wilde. On 31 July, the appeals court overturned Richards' conviction, and reduced Jagger's sentence to a conditional discharge. Jones' trial took place in November 1967. In December, after appealing the original prison sentence, Jones received a £1,000 fine and was put on 3 years probation, with an order to seek professional help. The band released their Satanic Majesty's Request, which reached number 3 in the UK and number 2 in the US, in December 1967. It drew unfavorable reviews and was widely regarded as a poor imitation of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Satanic Majesties was recorded while Jagger, Richards and Jones were awaiting their court cases. The band parted ways with Oldham during the sessions. The split was publicly amicable, but in 2003 Jagger said, "The reason Andrew left was because he thought that we weren't concentrating and that we were being childish. It was not a great moment really, and I would have thought it wasn't a great moment for Andrew either. There were a lot of distractions and you always need someone to focus you at that point. That was Andrew's job." Satanic Majesties became the first album the Rolling Stones produced on their own. Its psychedelic sound was complemented by the cover art, which featured a 3D photo by Michael Cooper, who had also photographed the cover of Sgt. Pepper. Bill Wyman wrote and sang a track on the album, In Another Land, also released as a single, the first on which Jagger did not sing lead. 1968 to 1972, Back to Basics. The band spent the first few months of 1968 working on material for their next album. Those sessions resulted in the song Jumpin' Jack Flash, released as a single in May. The subsequent album, Beggar's Banquet, an eclectic mix of country and blues-inspired tunes, marked the band's return to their roots. It was also the beginning of their collaboration with producer Jimmy Miller. It featured the lead single Street Fighting Man, which addressed the political upheavals of May 1968, and Sympathy for the Devil. Controversy over the design of the album cover, which featured a public toilet with graffiti covering the walls of a stall, delayed the album's release for nearly 6 months. It was well received at the time of release and reached number 3 in the UK and number 5 in the US. Richards said of the album, "There is a change between material on Satanic Majesties and Beggar's Banquet. I'd grown sick to death of the whole Maharishi Guru shit and the beads and bells. Who knows where these things come from, but I guess, the music, was a reaction to what we'd done in our time off and also that severe dose of reality. A spell in prison, will certainly give you room for thought. I was fucking pissed with being busted. So it was, right, we'll go and strip this thing down." There's a lot of anger in the music from that period. The Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which originally began as an idea about the new shape of the rock and roll concert tour, was filmed at the end of 1968. It featured John Lennon, Yoko Ono, The Dirty Mac, The Who, Jethro Tull, Marianne Faithfull, and Taj Mahal. The footage was shelved for 28 years but was finally released officially in 1996, with a DVD version released in October 2004. By the time of Beggar's Banquet's release, Brian Jones was only sporadically contributing to the band. Jagger said that Jones was not psychologically suited to this way of life. His drug use had become a hindrance, and he was unable to obtain a U.S. visa. Richards reported that in a June meeting with Jagger, Watts and himself at Jones' house, Jones admitted that he was unable to go on the road again, and left the band saying, "I've left, and if I want to I can come back." On July 3, 1969, less than a month later, Jones drowned under mysterious circumstances in the swimming pool at his home, Cochford Farm, in Hartfield, East Sussex. The band auditioned several guitarists, including Paul Kossoff, as a replacement for Jones before settling on Mick Taylor, who was recommended to Jagger by John Mayall. The Rolling Stones were scheduled to play at a free concert for Black Hill Enterprises in London's Hyde Park. 2 days after Jones' death, they decided to go ahead with the show as a tribute to him. The concert, their first with new guitarist Mick Taylor, was performed in front of an estimated 250,000 fans. A Granada television production team filmed the performance, which was broadcast on British television as The Stones in the Park. Black Hill Enterprises stage manager Sam Cutler introduced the Rolling Stones onto the stage by announcing, "Let's welcome the greatest rock and roll band in the world." Cutler repeated the introduction throughout their 1969 U.S. tour. Jagger read an excerpt from Shelley's poem Adonai Eyes, an elegy written on the death of his friend John Keats. They released Thousands of Butterflies in memory of Jones before opening their set with I'm Yours and I'm Hers, a Johnny Winter number. Also performed, but previously unheard by the audience, were Midnight Trembler and Love in Vain from their forthcoming album Let It Bleed, released December 1969, and Give Me a Drink, which eventually appeared on Exile on Main Street, released May 1972, as Loving Cup. The show also included the concert debut of Honky Tonk Women, which had been released the previous day. The Stones' last album of the 60s was Let It Bleed, which reached number 1 in the UK and number 3 in the US. It featured Gimme Shelter with guest lead female vocals by Mary Clayton, sister of Sam Clayton, of the American rock band Little Feat. Other tracks include You Can't Always Get What You Want, with accompaniment by the London Bach Choir, who initially asked that their name be removed from the album's credits after apparently being horrified by the content of some of its other material, but later withdrew this request. Midnight Trembler, as well as a cover of Robert Johnson's Love in Vain. Jones and Taylor are both featured on the album. Just after the US tour ended, the band performed at the Altamont Free Concert at the Altamont Speedway, about 50 miles, 80 kilometers, east of San Francisco. The Hells Angels biker gang provided security. A fan, Meredith Hunter, was stabbed and beaten to death by the Angels after they realized he was armed. Part of the tour, and the Altamont concert, was documented in Albert and David Masel's film Gimme Shelter. In response to the growing popularity of bootleg recordings, in particular Liver Than You'll Ever Be, recorded during the 1969 tour, the album Get Your Yeahs Out was released in 1970. Critic Lester Bangs declared it the best ever live album. It reached number 1 in the UK and number 6 in the US. At the end of the decade, the band appeared on the BBC's review of the 60s music scene Pop Go the 60s, performing Gimme Shelter, which was broadcast live on December 31, 1969. The following year, the band wanted out of contracts with both Klein and Decca, but still owed them a Jagger, Richards credited single. To get back at the label and fulfill their final contractual obligation, the band came up with the track Schoolboy Blues, deliberately making it as crude as they could in hopes of forcing Decca to keep it in the vaults. Amid contractual disputes with Klein, they formed their own record company, Rolling Stones Records. Sticky Fingers, released in March 1971, the band's first album on their own label, featured an elaborate cover designed by Andy Warhol. It was an Andy Warhol photograph of a man from the waist down in tight jeans featuring a functioning zipper. When unzipped, it revealed the subject's underwear, imprinted with a saying, "This is not," etc. In some markets, an alternate cover was released because of the perceived offensive nature of the original at the time. Sticky Fingers cover was the first to feature the logo of Rolling Stones Records, which effectively became the band's logo. It consisted of a pair of lips with a lapping tongue. Designer John Pass created the logo following a suggestion by Jagger to copy the outstuck tongue of the Hindu goddess Kali. Critic Sean Egan has said of the logo, without using the Stones' name, it instantly conjures them, or at least Jagger, as well as a certain lasciviousness that is the Stones' own. It quickly and deservedly became the most famous logo in the history of popular music. The tongue and lips design was part of a package that VH1 named the #1 greatest album cover of all time in 2003. The album contains one of their best-known hits, Brown Sugar, and the country-influenced Dead Flowers. Brown Sugar and Wild Horses were recorded at Alabama's Muscle Shoals Sound Studio during the 1969 American tour. The album continued the band's immersion into heavily blues-influenced compositions. The album is noted for its loose, ramshackle ambience and marked Mick Taylor's first full release with the band. Sticky Fingers reached #1 in both the UK and the US. The Stones' Decca catalog is currently owned by Klein's Apka label. In 1968, the Stones, acting on a suggestion by pianist Ian Stewart, put a control room in a van and created a mobile recording studio so they would not be limited to the standard 9 to 5 operating hours of most recording studios. The band lent the mobile studio to other artists, including Led Zeppelin, who used it to record Led Zeppelin III, 1970, and Led Zeppelin IV, 1971. Deep Purple immortalized the mobile studio itself in the song Smoke on the Water with the line "The rolling truck Stones thing just outside, making our music there." Following the release of Sticky Fingers, The Rolling Stones left England after receiving advice from their financial manager Prince Rupert Lowenstein. He recommended they go into tax exile before the start of the next financial year. The band had learned, despite being assured that their taxes were taken care of, they had not been paid for 7 years and the UK government was owed a relative fortune. The Stones moved to the south of France, where Richards rented the Villa Nocket and sublet rooms to band members and their entourage. Using the Rolling Stones mobile studio, they held recording sessions in the basement. They completed the new tracks, along with material dating as far back as 1969, at Sunset Studios in Los Angeles. The resulting double album, Exile on Main Street, was released in May 1972, and reached number 1 in both the US and the UK. Given an A+ grade by critic Robert Christgau and disparaged by Lester Bangs, who reversed his opinion within months, Exile is now accepted as one of the Stones' best albums. The films Cocksucker Blues, never officially released, and Ladies and Gentlemen, The Rolling Stones, released in 1974, document the subsequent highly publicized 1972 North American tour. The band's double compilation, Hot Rocks 1964 to 1971, was released in 1972. It reached number 3 in the UK and number 4 in the US. It is certified diamond in the US, having sold over 12 million copies, and spent over 264 weeks on the Billboard album chart. In 1974, Bill Wyman was the first band member to release solo material, his album Monkey Grip. As of 2018, Wyman has released 5 solo albums, with the most recent, Back to Basics, released in 2015. 1972 to 1977, Critical Fluctuations and Ronnie Wood. Members of the band set up a complex financial structure in 1972 to reduce the amount of their taxes. Their holding company, Prima Group, has offices in both the Netherlands and the Caribbean. The Netherlands was chosen because it does not directly tax royalty payments. The band have been tax exiles ever since, meaning they can no longer use Britain as their main residence. Due to the arrangements with the holding company, the band has reportedly paid a tax of just 1.6% on their total earnings of £242 million over the past 20 years. In November 1972, the band began recording sessions in Kingston, Jamaica, for the album Goat's Head Soup. It was released in 1973 and reached number 1 in both the UK and US. The album, which contained the worldwide hit Angie, was the first in a string of commercially successful but tepidly received studio albums. The sessions for Goat's Head Soup also produced unused material, most notably an early version of the popular ballad Waiting on a Friend, which was not released until the Tattoo LP 8 years later. Another legal battle over drugs, dating back to their stay in France, interrupted the making of Goat's Head Soup. Authorities had issued a warrant for Richards' arrest and the other band members had to return briefly to France for questioning. This, along with Jagger's 1967 and 1970 convictions on drug charges, complicated the band's plans for their Pacific tour in early 1973. They were denied permission to play in Japan and almost banned from Australia. A European tour followed in September and October 1973, which bypassed France, coming after Richards' arrest in England on drug charges. The 1974 album It's Only Rock and Roll was recorded in the Musicland Studios in Munich, Germany. It reached number 2 in the UK and number 1 in the US. Miller was not invited to return as the album's album producer because his contribution level had dropped. Jagger and Richards produced the album, credited as the Glimmer Twins. Both the album and the single of the same name were hits. Near the end of 1974, Taylor began to lose patience after years of feeling like a junior citizen in the band of jaded veterans. The band situation made normal functioning complicated, with members living in different countries, and legal barriers restricting where they could tour. In addition, drug use was starting to affect Richards' productivity, and Taylor felt some of his own creative contributions were going unrecognized. At the end of 1974, with a recording session already booked in Munich to record another album, Taylor quit the Rolling Stones. Taylor said in 1980, "I was getting a bit fed up. I wanted to broaden my scope as a guitarist and do something else. I wasn't really composing songs or writing at that time. I was just beginning to write, and that influenced my decision. There are some people who can just ride along from crest to crest, they can ride along somebody else's success. And there are some people for whom that's not enough. It really wasn't enough for me. The Stones needed a new guitarist, and the recording sessions for the next album, Black and Blue, 1976, number 2 in the UK, number 1 in the US, and Munich provided an opportunity for some guitarists hoping to join the band to work while trying out. Guitarists as stylistically disparate as Peter Frampton and Jeff Beck were auditioned, as well as Robert A. Johnson and Chiotis. Both Beck and Irish blues rock guitarist Rory Gallagher later claimed they had played without realizing they were being auditioned. American session players Wayne Perkins and Harvey Mandel also tried out, but Richards and Jagger preferred for the band to remain purely British. When Ronnie Wood auditioned, everyone agreed he was the right choice. He had already recorded and played live with Richards, and had contributed to the recording and writing of the track It's Only Rock and Roll. He had declined Jagger's earlier offer to join the Stones, because of his commitment to the Faces, saying that's what's really important to me. Faces lead singer Rod Stewart went so far as to say he would take bets that Wood would not join the Stones. Wood officially joined the Rolling Stones in 1975 for their upcoming tour of the Americas, which was a contributing factor in the disbandment of the Faces. Unlike the other band members, however, Wood was a salaried employee, which remained the case until the early 1990s, when he finally joined the Stones business partnership. The 1975 tour of the Americas kicked off in New York City with the band performing on a flatbed trailer being pulled down Broadway. The tour featured stage props including a giant phallus and a rope on which Jagger swung out over the audience. Jagger had booked live recording sessions at the El Macumbo, a club in Toronto, to produce a long overdue live album, 1977's Love You Live, the first Stones live album since Get Your Yeahs Out. It reached number 3 in the UK and number 5 in the US. Richards' addiction to heroin delayed his arrival in Toronto. The other members had already arrived. On February 24, 1977, when Richards and his family flew in from London, they were temporarily detained by Canada Customs after Richards was found in possession of a burnt spoon and hash residue. 3 days later, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, armed with an arrest warrant for Anita Pallenberg, discovered 22 grams, 0.78 ounces, of heroin in Richards' room. He was charged with importing narcotics into Canada, an offense that carried a minimum 7-year sentence. The Crown prosecutor later conceded that Richards had procured the drugs after his arrival. Despite the incident, the band played 2 shows in Toronto, only to cause more controversy when Margaret Trudeau, then wife of Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, was seen partying with the band after one show. The band's shows were not advertised to the public. Instead, the El Macumbo had been booked for the entire week by April Wine for a recording session. 1050 Chum, a local radio station, ran a contest for free tickets to see April Wine. Contest winners who selected tickets for Friday or Saturday night were surprised to find the Rolling Stones playing. On 4th of March, Richards' partner Anita Pallenberg pleaded guilty to drug possession and incurred a fine in connection with the original airport incident. The drug case against Richards dragged on for over a year. Ultimately, he received a suspended sentence and was ordered to play 2 free concerts for the CNIB in Oshawa. Both shows featured the Rolling Stones and the New Barbarians, a group that Wood had put together to promote his latest solo album, which Richards also joined. This episode strengthened Richards' resolve to stop using heroin. It also ended his relationship with Pallenberg, which had become strained since the death of their 3rd child, Tara. Pallenberg was unable to curb her heroin addiction as Richards struggled to get clean. While Richards was settling his legal and personal problems, Jagger continued his jet-set lifestyle. He was a regular at New York's Studio 54 Disco Club, often in the company of model Jerry Hall. His marriage to Bianca Jagger ended in 1977, although they had long been estranged. Although the Rolling Stones remained popular through the early 1970s, Music critics had begun to grow dismissive of the band's output, and record sales failed to meet expectations. By the mid-1970s, after punk rock became influential, many people had begun to view the Rolling Stones as an outdated band. 1978 to 1982, commercial peak. The group's fortunes changed in 1978, after the band released Some Girls, which included the hit single Miss You, the country ballad Faraway Eyes, Beast of Burden and Shattered. In part as a response to punk, many songs, particularly Respectable, were fast, basic, guitar-driven rock and roll, and the album's success re-established the Rolling Stones' immense popularity among young people. It reached number 2 in the UK and number 1 in the US. Following the US tour 1978, the band guested on the first show of the 4th season of the TV series Saturday Night Live. Following the success of Some Girls, the band released their next album Emotional Rescue in mid-1980. During recording sessions for the album, a rift between Jagger and Richards was slowly developing. Richards wanted to tour in the summer or autumn of 1980 to promote the new album. Much to his disappointment, Jagger declined. Emotional Rescue hit the top of the charts on both sides of the Atlantic and the title track reached number 3 in the US. In early 1981, the group reconvened and decided to tour the US that year, leaving little time to write and record a new album, as well as rehearse for the tour. That year's resulting album, Tattoo You, featured a number of outtakes, including lead single Start Me Up, which reached number 2 in the US and ranked number 22 on Billboard's Hot 100 year-end chart. 2 songs, Waiting on a Friend, US number 13, and Tops, featured Mick Taylor's unused rhythm guitar tracks, while jazz saxophonist Sonny Rollins played on Slave and Waiting on a Friend. The album reached number 2 in the UK and number 1 in the US. The Rolling Stones reached number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1982 with Hang Fire. Their American tour 1981 was their biggest, longest and most colorful production to date. It was the highest-grossing tour of that year. It included a concert at Chicago's Checkerboard Lounge with Muddy Waters, in one of his last performances before his death in 1983. Some of the shows were recorded. This resulted in the 1982 live album Still Life, American Concert 1981, which reached number 4 in the UK and number 5 in the US, and the 1983 Hal Ashby concert film Let's Spend the Night Together, filmed at Sun Devil Stadium in Tempe, Arizona and the Brendan Byrne Arena in the Meadowlands, New Jersey. In mid-1982, to commemorate their 20th anniversary, the Rolling Stones took their American stage show to Europe. The European Tour 1982 was their first in 6 years and used a similar format to the American tour. The band were joined by former Allman Brothers Band keyboardist Chuck Leavell, who continues to perform and record with them. By the end of the year, the Stones signed a new 4-album recording deal with a new label, CBS Records, for a reported $50 million, then the biggest record deal in history. 1983 to 1988, band turmoil and solo projects. Before leaving Atlantic, the Rolling Stones released Undercover in late 1983. It reached number 3 in the UK and number 4 in the US. Despite good reviews and the top 10 peak position of the title track, the record sold below expectations and there was no tour to support it. Subsequently, the Stones' new marketer, distributor CBS Records took over distributing their Atlantic catalog. By this time, the Jagger-Richards rift had grown significantly. To Richards' annoyance, Jagger signed a solo deal with CBS Records and spent much of 1984 writing songs for his first album. He also declared his growing lack of interest in the Rolling Stones. By 1985, Jagger was spending more time on solo recordings. Much of the material on 1986's Dirty Work was generated by Richards, with more contributions from Wood than on previous Rolling Stones albums. It was recorded in Paris, and Jagger was often absent from the studio, leaving Richards to keep the recording sessions moving forward. In June 1985, Jagger teamed up with David Bowie for Dancing in the Street, which was recorded for the Live Aid charity movement. This was one of Jagger's first solo performances, and the song reached number 1 in the UK, and no 7 in the US. In December 1985, Stewart died of a heart attack. The Rolling Stones played a private tribute concert for him at London's 100 Club in February 1986. 2 days later they were presented with a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Dirty Work was released in March 1986 to mixed reviews, reaching number 4 in both the US and UK. It was the Stones' first album for CBS with an outside producer, Steve Lillywhite. With relations between Richards and Jagger at an all-time low, Jagger refused to tour to promote the album and instead undertook a solo tour, where he performed some Rolling Stones songs. As a result of their animosity, the Stones almost broke up. Jagger's solo records, She's the Boss, 1985, which reached number 6 in the UK and number 13 in the US, and Primitive Cool, 1987, which reached number 26 in the UK and number 41 in the US, met with moderate commercial success. In 1988, with the Rolling Stones mostly inactive, Richards released his first solo album, Talk Is Cheap, which reached number 37 in the UK and number 24 in the US. It was well received by fans and critics, and certified gold in the US. Richards has subsequently referred to this late 80s period, where the two were recording solo albums with no obvious reunion of the Stones in sight, as World War III. The following year, 25 by 5, The Continuing Adventures of the Rolling Stones, a documentary spanning the band's career, was released for their 25th anniversary. 1989 to 1999, comeback and record-breaking tours. In early 1989, the Stones, including Mick Taylor and Ronnie Wood as well as Brian Jones and Ian Stewart, posthumously, were inducted into the American Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Jagger and Richards set aside their animosity and went to work on a new Rolling Stones album, Steel Wheels. Heralded as a return to form, it included the singles Mixed Emotions, US number 5, Rock in a Hard Place, US number 23, and Almost Hear You Sigh. The album also included Continental Drift, which the Rolling Stones recorded in Tangier, Morocco in 1989 with the master musicians of Tijuca led by Butcher Atter, coordinated by Tony King and Sherry Nutting. Nigel Finch produced a BBC documentary film The Rolling Stones in Morocco. The album reached number 2 in the UK and number 3 in the US. The Steel Wheels, Urban Jungle Tour was the band's first world tour in 7 years and their biggest stage production to date. Opening acts included Living Colour and Guns N' Roses. Recordings from the tour include the 1991 concert album Flashpoint, which reached number 6 in the UK and number 16 in the US, and the concert film Live at the Max, released in 1991. The tour was Bill Wyman's last. After years of deliberation, he decided to leave the band, although his retirement was not made official until January 1993. He then published Stone Alone, an autobiography based on scrapbooks and diaries he had kept since the band's early days. A few years later he formed Bill Wyman's Rhythm Kings and began recording and touring again. After the successes of the Steel Wheels, Urban Jungle tours, the band took a break. Watts released 2 jazz albums. Wood recorded his 5th solo album, the first in 11 years, called Slide on This. Wyman released his 4th solo album. Richards released his 2nd solo album in late 1992, Main Offender, and did a small tour including big concerts in Spain and Argentina. Jagger got good reviews and sales with his 3rd solo album, Wandering Spirit, which reached number 12 in the UK and number 11 in the US. The album sold more than 2 million copies worldwide, being certified gold in the US. After Wyman's departure, the Rolling Stones' new distributor, record label, Virgin Records, remastered and repackaged the band's back catalog from Sticky Fingers to Steel Wheels, except for the 3 live albums. They issued another hits compilation in 1993 entitled Jump Back, which reached number 16 in the UK and number 30 in the US. By 1993, the Stones were ready to start recording another studio album. Charlie Watts chose Daryl Jones, a former sideman of Miles Davis and Sting, as Wyman's replacement for 1994's Voodoo Lounge. The album met with strong reviews and sales, going double platinum in the US. Reviewers took note and credited the album's traditionalist sounds to the Rolling Stones' new producer Don Was. Voodoo Lounge won the Grammy Award for Best Rock Album at the 1995 Grammy Awards. It reached number 1 in the UK and number 2 in the US. The accompanying Voodoo Lounge tour lasted into the following year and grossed $320 million, becoming the world's highest-grossing tour at the time. Mostly acoustic numbers from various concerts and rehearsals made up Strip, which reached number 9 in the UK and the US. It featured a cover of Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, as well as infrequently played songs like Shine a Light, Sweet Virginia and The Spider and the Fly. On September 8, 1994, the Stones performed their new song Love is Strong and Start Me Up at the 1994 MTV Video Music Awards at Radio City Music Hall in New York. The band received the Lifetime Achievement Award at the ceremony. The Rolling Stones were the first major recording artists to broadcast a concert over the Internet, a 20